Okay, I'm Steve Threadgold, the digital editor of the Journal of Youth Studies, and today I'm joined by Bjorn Schiermer, who has received the runner-up prize in the 2024 Andy Furlong Best Paper in the Journal. So, congratulations, Bjorn.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm extremely proud of that, of course. But thanks, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really great. So the prize is in honor of Andy Furlong, the founding editor of the journal, someone that many of us that are involved in the journal had a great relationship with. So it's in honor of him. It's kind of a great opportunity to be able to keep his name associated with the journal. And so that's how the prize was born. This is the second year it's been running. And so um, what we'd like to do for the next kind of 20 minutes or so is just get you to have a bit of a chat about your paper and contextualize it, and we can talk about different aspects of it and things like that in terms of youth studies. So, I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you is, what's been your relationship to youth studies?
Well, basically, it already started at my when I wrote my PhD. So I wrote my PhD in fashion
Yep.
on as a social, I mean, as a collective dynamic on the one hand, but also, of course, in a more narrow sense about clothing, basically, right? And I think already at that point, I kind of came across some of the CCCS stuff, of course, hip digital stuff,
Mhm.
right? Which is really about, in a certain sense, it's about clothing, it's about style, right?
Yep.
And then it's about subculture. So that was kind of like already at that point, maybe on a more kind of subconscious level, I kind of like started to think about subcultural studies and became interested,
Mhm.
and then at the same time, I also had some other kind of popular cultural interests. So I wrote about hipsterism and more popular cultural stuff, and kind of also turned me into to kind of festival culture and stuff. So yeah, so it kind of pointed kind of slowly in that direction where I kind of ended up now.
Yeah. And just as an aside here, we met about 10 years ago in Copenhagen when I
Yeah.
was writing about hipsters, and I visited you for a little while there while in Copenhagen. That was a great time. And it was around actually the Journal of Youth Studies conference that was in Copenhagen in
Yeah.
2015. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll get you to kind of talk a little bit about your paper, it's the motivations for
Yes.
it, to summarize it a bit, what kind of intervention that you're making with this paper.
Yeah, of course, it is kind of complex. Maybe I should just say that. Um, so I was interested in subculture and subculture theory, and there was a lot of course, debate starting even back from the 90s and continuing through the zeros, right? Much of that debate actually carried out in Journal of Youth Studies
Mm,
that really had to do with kind of like conceptual issues. I mean, how to really which concepts to use to understand youth culture,
mhm,
and also, of course, in a situation where kind of paradoxically, I mean, empirically, youth culture became more and more fragmented. Um, so there was really a need for kind of conceptual development, and I was kind of all along orientated into that discourse, right? I mean, Shane
mhm.
Blackman and
Yep.
Andy Bennett and David Hills-Mondhalk and David Bartleson, I mean, Paul Hodgkins and those people. And
Mhm.
so I read a lot of that stuff, right? And all the time, um, I felt that I had something to say that wasn't really set in that discourse for a lot of very complex theoretical reasons, of course, right?
Yep.
But I mean, some of them wanted something else than me, and somebody wanted to go a bit in the same direction, but maybe not as radical as I wanted it. So I kind of like theorized or looked at the empirical world through that discourse and tried to kind of like simply figure out what I thought was lacking or what kind of lacuna that was. And basically that took me 10 years. And then I, I, I wrote the paper in 2000 and I don't know, 2023, 24-ish. Um, yeah. So I don't know if you want to go deeper into that kind of theoretical stuff, but because of
Yeah.
course it's it's complicated. And some of those people are more inspiring. I mean, of course, I mean the seminal paper uh, by Andy Bennett. I mean, this. I think it's from 98, 99, something. This subculture or neo tribes. I mean,
Mm.
that extremely important paper really pushed me actually to go and see Michel Maffesoli. So I went to France in a period, and then I kind of got acquainted with that work, and then I started to feel basically okay. I mean, actually, Maffesoli is kind of more collectivist in a certain sense than I think Bennett is
Mhm.
really. Probably because Bennett was orientated towards another discourse at the time and stuff. So, I mean, so there's a lot of stations on the way that kind of ended up
Yep.
in that paper. But of
Yeah.
course, it leans on a lot of extremely brilliant scholarly work, some of which has actually some of which is actually found in the Journal of Youth
Yeah.
Culture. Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you do in the paper is that you kind of you critically engage with a lot of foundational work, but you kind of point out its strengths and then
Mm.
kind of make your own argument to, contribute to maybe helping
Yeah.
the weaknesses. Um, it's a really interesting thing. Like you kind of a key claim of the paper is that much of the study of youth culture just doesn't engage with the collective nature of it. That's right. That's one of the
Yeah.
main points, isn't it? So what
Yeah,
why do you
that's
think that's been the
probably
case? It's it's kind of ironic in a way. Yeah.
um yeah, well basically, I mean, absolutely you're right. I mean, that's probably the basic point of it, right? And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. Um I think basically kind of like the whole I mean really to kind of get to the roots, I think really from the beginning, from the Birmingham outset in a certain sense
Mm.
of subcultural studies, right? Basically started as a Marxian kind of enterprise. I mean, so I write a little bit about this seminal paper. I think it's even from 72 or
Yep.
something. I mean, the Phil Cohen
Yep.
paper, right? And I mean, even there, kind of Marxist inspired, of course.
Yeah.
It's difficult in that frame to have. I mean, in that frame to have collective sentiments and affects, because the very idea coming all the way from Marx is, of course, to emphasize alienation and isolation, right?
Yep.
And atomization, it's called in the critical kind of tradition, right? So there is a really important basic theoretical thrust in the other direction.
Hmm.
Um, and then later on, of course, there's the post-structuralist inspiration also that kind of imprints or puts an imprint on the field. And of course the Birmingham the CCCS guys were extremely sophisticated theoretically, so they really went all in. And if you see Hepnich's book, right, it's really a question of style. It's really a question of, in a certain sense, communication through clothing, basically,
Yeah.
and music.
Semiotics. Yeah.
Yeah, semiotics, right? And I mean, there's one scene that kind of, when I speak about it now, that kind of like struck me. So, I mean, at a certain instance, yeah, Hepnich talk about doing the pogo, right? You know, the punk dance.
Yep.
They stand there, and I just remember that, of course, Hepnich sees that as a okay, consciously or magically, right? They show the alienation with the capitalist, I don't know, uh, automatic mode of production
Yep.
and all that stuff. And he doesn't see that there was also a way of being together, basically, right?
Mm.
I mean, of course, a concert and those way of doing the same thing at the same time, bodily and so on, turning towards the stage. I mean, aligning with other bodies. He has no view at all for the kind of collective, right, aspects of it all.
Yeah, and so in the paper you turn to Durkheim for that and talk about collective effervescence.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I do.
yeah,
So basically what so that of course everybody, I mean, everybody who's gone through a study of sociology has heard about the concept of effervescence, right?
yeah.
Effervescence in Durkheim. So it's about collective emotions and energies, right? What fewer people really appreciate is that if you actually read Durkheim, it's really tied to objects.
Mhm.
So in his accounts, of course, it's about totem objects, right?
Yep,
And the Australians, they dance, they make the ritual around those objects, right? And
yep.
then there's a kind of like interesting circular self-enforcing dynamic. Okay, if it's a good ritual, okay, so well, collective images emerge, right? And they're kind of, according to Durkheim, projected in a certain sense upon that object. Then that object becomes more important.
Hmm.
It gains it gains simply in a phenomenological surplus, right? It
Yeah,
gains attraction, it gains power,
gains
and that
gravity.
of course makes it yeah, that makes it possible for that object to help gather the crowd in turn, which
Mm.
then of course in turn, I mean, promotes even more collective sentiment. So there's a kind of self-enforcing circuit there that I that I find extremely interesting, and that's of course a danger too, but that I see everywhere, so
Yep,
to speak.
yep.
Um,
Okay.
and then there's another story. So I'm also inspired by some of the recent stuff by the later Bruno Latour and some of that ANT
Hmm.
stuff. But that's and I try to work that into the Durkheimian template a little bit to the
Yep.
extent it's possible. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Just as an aside here, there's an Australian sociologist called Ashley Barnwell that's written a great paper a few years ago called Durkheim as an Effect Theorist. It's I highly recommend
Oh
it.
yeah,
Yeah, it's really
yeah,
good.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
very inspirational for the book that I read about Bjorn effect. It's really good
yeah.
stuff.
I could
Okay, so
imagine.
with in the book, yeah. So and the other thing you kind of ask people to pay more attention to is not just the collective aspects of these things, but the material aspects. So can you talk a little bit about why they're so important? You kind of touched upon it then in terms of how something becomes important and has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of
Yeah,
collectivity going around it.
yeah.
Could you maybe go into that a little bit more in terms of how things are important in some
Yeah,
way?
yeah, that's I guess this is kind of like this Latourian inspiration
Mm,
basically, but it's not only Latour. I think that's kind of, as you very well know, kind of like there's been a movement in that direction. So new materialist kind of approaches, and I
yep,
think some of that stuff is extremely interesting. And I try to go about it in a very phenomenological way, okay, broadly understood. I think that more conscious pay to the way we deal with the objects around us simply makes us better phenomenologists in a certain sense. I
mhm,
mean, as a tool to kind of really develop descriptions about what is going on. I think that some of those perspectives are really, really, really well apt for doing stuff like that. So the idea is basically that I try um, to move into kind of like yeah, a more effective, a more intense kind of concept of action or practice in a certain sense,
yep,
um, which investigate how objects of all kinds really help you, prompt you, um, orientate you, help you to develop new ideas about other stuff to do. And I mean, in certain sense, also a part of the creative kind of like being in the world in a certain sense. And
yep,
that space, that way of describing agency and describing action, I find it extremely interesting, actually, and
yep,
extremely empirically kind of fruitful for me, at least.
yep. Great. Okay. So yeah, you throughout the paper you kind of critically engage with some key works, and then you point out to some works that you see kind kind of do point to collectivity and
Yeah.
materiality. So we don't need to go into those individual kind of examples
Mhm.
too much. You discuss them at length.
Yeah.
I'm interested in like a question here for you in terms of like how much does methodology play a role in terms of, the critiques you're making here?
Uh,
Um,
yeah, it's a really good question, actually.
yeah,
I have to
because some
think
of the things you
because
kind of talk about critically in the paper that kind of point to people maybe just describing things but not
yeah,
really
yeah, yeah,
analyzing seem to me
yeah,
relate as much to methodology as a conceptual point of view.
yeah, exactly. Maybe I should just start to say, in a certain sense, I feel a little bit kind of discouraged in the sense that I don't do my own empirical work in the
Right.
paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So I basically steal other people's brilliant stuff. And of course, I mean, I just have to say, of course, that I lean, right? So I lean on,
Yeah.
well, Learning to Labor, Paul Willis, and
Yeah.
especially the first chapters in his book. I mean, everybody who reads that book will be at least read, right, in a certain sense, post Latour, and I mean, will be simply baffled by how much the objects actually kind of mean and
Mm.
and collective sentiments too in Lilly's actual kind of empirical descriptions there. So they simply begged me to kind of dig into that dimension. At the same time, what is interesting about Willis, I think, I mean, all really great sociologists, right? In a certain sense, I think, even if they don't have the theory, some of those people are simply so empirically sensitive in a certain sense. I mean, so of
Yeah.
course, he succeeds in developing really, really good descriptions, even though, if you ask me, he falls back in a kind of more actor structured theoretical perspective at the end of that book. Um, but still, those empirical descriptions really beg for the concepts that I want to use, right? And I think to a certain extent that I try to show how these descriptions could be actually, well, further developed in a certain sense.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't want to make a big distinction between description and actual analysis. That
Hmm.
would be kind of too complex. But I guess you're right. I mean, in a certain sense, that what I try to do is actually primarily descriptive,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Um, and even before I start answering your question really to methodology, I also have to say, because now I've mentioned Village, so I have to mention simply, what is, I mean, Sarah Rain's extremely brilliant, beautiful book on the Northern soul scene. All
Yep.
right, I mean, I really, really, really like that book, and basically it's kind of the same as the Paul Willis thing, that I actually steal some of her descriptions and then try to show how this Durkheimian,
Hmm.
Latourian kind of thing may be conceptually developed or used to develop those descriptions, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that being said, I don't have that much to say about methodology,
Yep.
which is of course embarrassing, and of course I
No, it's not.
do,
No, it's not.
um,
It's just an interesting
I
question to
do,
think about, like the differences of the different things that you're kind of critically
yeah,
engaging with. Yeah.
yeah,
And their
but
own
of course.
purposes, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, but of course you're right, and there are other people. I mean, other papers. I mean, there's a chapter in, I think, some of my work with Valentina Kutsukrea and Ben Gook.
Yep.
There's this one where where I write about festival experiences, and
Yep.
of course, my idea is that if you really want to investigate this kind of more phenomenological dimension, experiential dimension in a broad sense, and how collective aspects and relations to object work. I mean, you have to generate some kind of a qualitative kind of depth
Hmm.
access, right? And so, I mean, interviewing, of course, I would say, and also goes for most of us probably, old boomers who've once been in that. If it's about music culture, we have some autoethnographic experience
Yeah.
ourselves, probably along the way. Um, And then finally, I mean, I would also engage, and I try to do that myself, some more creative, tactile, uh, bodily forms of reenactment, maybe of
Yep.
some of those experiences, just to kind of help, um, to turn the implicit, transparent stuff for many of us into kind of well, explicit phenomenological descriptions.
Yep.
And that is, of course, the difficult part.
Yep.
It's a part that is difficult. It's a difficulty that we share with a lot of other phenomenologists, right? Simply trying to make what is really transparent, really to dig that into the open. And I think that is really the basic challenge of that way of working.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's at least a difficulty, methodological difficulty that we share with a lot of other people. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Well, thanks
Okay.
for talking to us about your paper.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
and
it's an and again,
again, thanks so much. I mean,
yeah,
for the yeah,
yep,
for the attention.
yeah, congratulations again. And so yeah, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Iggy.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks, Stephen. See you.